I want to tell you a little bit about the Science Gateways Community Institute, which sponsors this webinar. We have 3 areas of service. One is in the area of support for building and running gateways. We have hands-on development support as well as advice from consultants, and we also offer a catalog of gateways and software. That catalog is available for you to enter your own projects in, but also to browse through and look for projects that might be examples of what you'd like to accomplish, or an idea of how you might make use of certain kinds of software in your project. Our second area of our services is in education and training, including this webinar series, of course. We also offer a boot camp, which you saw advertised on that first slide there. Our next one will be in May, and the deadline for applying for your project team to attend is in March. It's a week-long intensive program. It's really a lot of fun too, and people really appreciate what they come out with from it at the end of that week. We also offer a number of student-focused programs, including internships. So we do have opportunities for your project to engage an intern, and then we have an annual conference, which will be in September in San Diego, as well as all of our website resources and materials. And then our third area is of service is just the networking and community that we provide. We have a number of partners who provide support. Part of what motivated this particular webinar is the work that we've done with Trusted CI, which provides all sorts of advice about cybersecurity. We also have an affiliates program, which is projects that have expressed interest in supporting people who want to use their software. So if you find something in our catalog that you'd like to use and you'd like to know more about it, with some direct conversation, you can reach out to those who are affiliates. And of course, our website includes a blog, news, community forum, and our annual conference is also a great way to meet people. So those are 3 interconnected areas provided by our team, and I do hope this webinar will intrigue you enough to make use of other things that we have to offer. And finally, I just want to ask you a quick favor. We do like to collect feedback from people, not only about how this webinar went, but also suggestions for future topics. So if you can take a few moments at the end of this webinar or before you leave to give us feedback about this, I'll put this link in our chat area partway through the presentation and also at the end of this presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to our team of expert panelists, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Jim can start doing that. So we have 3 people joining us today to present. We have Jim Basney, Tom Barton, and Marlene Pierce. I think we're going to be presenting in that order, and they're going to be talking about authorizing access to Science Gateway resources, and I'll let them talk more about who they are and what they're going to tell you.
Great, thanks very much, Catherine, and thanks for SGCI for hosting us today. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm very glad that Marlene and Tom are going to be also participating in our presentation today. I'm from NCSA and Trusted CI. Marlene is from Indiana University and SGCI, and Tom is from University of Chicago and Internet2. I'm going to talk a bit at the start, then hand off to Tom, and then hand off to Marlene. And so on this first slide, this is my simple mental model about science gateways. And for the purposes of discussing authorization, I think about science gateways as these web apps that give access to resources. And so we need to talk about authorization mechanisms and policies for accessing these resources. And the resources can include compute capacity, scientific instruments, scientific data, and also licensed software and all of these components can have different ways that they're provided. They may be hosted and provided by the Science Gateway itself. They may be provided by external resource providers, and so we might have a combination of policies to enforce in our authorization methods. So when we're thinking about authorization, we are implementing policies that may come from the different sources that determine the acceptable use of the resources, the limits of the resources, and restricted access to instruments and data and computing. And another important use case for us, I think, is research collaborations, where researchers are coming together and their work product is private among them as they're doing their work until they publish it, and because they want to be first to publish their novel results. And so we take these policies and we want to implement them with procedures and mechanisms that can include doing authorization based on user affiliation, allowing researchers to form their own collaboration groups, allowing researchers to bring their own resources to the gateway, like bringing their own data or compute, like through a cloud compute resource, doing a peer review allocation process, and also having some way of blacklisting in case of misuse. And the mechanisms can be based on attributes and groups and roles, allocations, and also a really important mechanism is delegated management of the authorization. So it's not just the gateway operator controlling who has access to everybody, but the scientists can self-organize and manage access to the resources. So in our presentation today, we'll be talking about different authorization mechanisms that can fall into some of these categories listed here. Identity-based, where the user identifiers are put into access control lists, and that determines who gets access to the resource. Attribute-based, where the access policy is based on attributes about the user, like faculty, staff, or student at a university. Role-based, where the access control is based on group memberships and roles, and often that can be based on a role in a research collaboration, or it could be that you're a principal investigator of the collaboration, or you're assistant administrator, and that gives you additional rights to resources. And we'll also talk about capability-based authorization, where tokens are issued that allow specific actions on resources. So setting the authorization policy really depends on who owns the resource, and it can, in a Science Gateway scenario, we can combine resources owned by users, the gateway operators, and external resource providers. So you could have an award for access to a supercomputer through Exceed, or you can buy time on Amazon Web Services. You could have a license to some software, or a license to use some proprietary data. And and users may be uploading and downloading their own data and setting sharing policies. So having the flexibility to support these resources coming together at the Science Gateway in an authorization system is very important for us. And so I mentioned that I'm from Trusted CI. Trusted CI is a partner with SGCI that offers support for cybersecurity challenges for Science Gateways. And so if you have authorization challenges in your Science Gateway, please let us know, contact us, and we can do specialized engagements, consultations, and offer additional trainings that this is an example of. So one example of a resource that Trusted CI provides is an acceptable use policy template. And so when we are thinking about access control and authorization, it's easy to jump immediately to mechanisms that ensure that nobody ever misuses resources, never violates the policy. But a good first step is to just write up the policy and set the expectations on the users and document the consequences for violating the policy. So even if every aspect of your policy doesn't have a mechanism that's controlling it, you're at least communicating what's proper behavior among the users of your Science Gateway, and can be very effective even if you're not enforcing every aspect of the policies in your gateway. Another resource that Trusted CI provides is the Open Cyber Risk Profile. And so as you're thinking about authorization to your resources, you want to understand the different resources that are being used in your gateway, especially the scientific assets in your gateway, like scientific data sets and scientific instruments that may have unique authorization policies associated with them. And so the OSCRP allows you to think about the risks associated with those assets, and you can draw these diagrams that go from the avenues of attack to concerns to consequences that can help to determine what sort of policies should be your top priority to enforce. So because Science gateways use resources that are provided by other resource providers. It's important to support delegated authorization. And for a while now, we have been working under an authorization model developed under TerraGrid that supports two authorization modes. One we call the transitive mode, where the user is authorized to access the science gateway, and then the science gateway is authorized to access the other resources. So the actual resource provider is just giving a block grant of resources to the science gateway and leaving it up to the science gateway to determine who gets access. Another way of doing it is what we call in the paper authorization credentials mode, where the science gateway accesses resources on the user's behalf via user-specific credentials. And the OAuth standard is a perfect fit for this. Quoting from the standard, Science Gateway is an application making protected resource requests on behalf of the resource owner with its authorization. And so here are some references on write-ups about the model that supports these two types of delegated authorization. And so here's a diagram of the OAuth protocol showing how a user, through their web browser or user agent accessing the Science Gateway, can support a flow where the Science Gateway says, to use this resource, I need authorization. So send me to the authorization server. The user approves access to that resource by the Science Gateway. That ends up issuing an access token that then the gateway can use at the resource server. And that step where the user is approving the access for the Science Gateway, I think, is a really key part of OAuth. And you probably see it in your day-to-day work. So here's an example of authorizing Travis CI to access a GitHub repository. And what this authorization screen is telling me is the specific scopes of access that Travis CI wants to my GitHub account. And I have the and who's requesting that access. So in this case, it's the Travis CI app, and I have the ability to approve or deny that access. So the step of restricting access by a specific scope and requiring the user's consent is a really key part of the OAuth flow that I think is a good model to follow. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to Tom, but also we could break if there's any questions or comments.
Well, hearing none, I'll just say hello, everyone. Glad to be speaking with you all here. I wanted to start out by announcing, I was told just last week that Internet2 has executed a partnership agreement with SGCI, which is fantastic. And it's quite new. I don't think there's any reflection on anyone's website as yet, and nor have we really worked out the coordinating details, but that's all coming quickly. And I just wanted to kind of put up a quick table of the kinds of things that Internet2 can provide help with under the partnership program. To perhaps somewhat familiar, Federated Access through the In-Common Federation. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Internet2 is probably best known for its research networks and research networking expertise, but that may be a great avenue for when there's questions about how Gateway is performing over the network, that maybe we can help. We do Edgy Roam in the United States, Internet2 does. And then there's this whole suite of identity and access management software that's been produced over, at this point, I think, almost 18 years. So lots of experience with that. And Internet2 is just commencing a new program to get a lot of experience of doing research workflows in commercial clouds under the Exploring Clouds for Acceleration of Science program that was announced by the National Science Foundation recently. So the basic bottom line is, I think the idea is that under this partnership is where Internet2 has something that may be of value to gateway developers and operators, we want to be able to provide that to you. And so just FYI. Jim, could you advance, please? So focusing a moment on that IAM software, there are these main components, the shibboleth, which is probably the most common SAML federation software in the world today, not just in the R&E world, but certainly quite ubiquitous. And it's having OpenID Connect protocols being added to it right now. Grouper, which is access management, including delegation and all of those mechanisms that Jim listed earlier in one of his slides. And I'll talk a little bit about, I'll give an example of Grouper in a moment. Co-manage, which is really something tailored for academic collaborations. It fits really well in Jim's original model of that gateway thing between the user and the resources for managing the interaction between those two. And something kind of new to the suite, the Midpoint, which is an open source product whose development is focused in Europe, that is an identity registry. But the real value here is it's a mix. It's partly the products, but it's really, I would say, there's a well-established, broad, extensive global community that has developed alongside developing these products and solving lots of problems with them, a great deal of expertise. And I think perhaps the partnership of Internet2 with SGCCI can be a bridge between those experts and your needs. Jim, could you advance the slide? Thank you very much. I see the Jim AI is working better than Tom's manual mode. Thank you. I'll say a little bit about federated access. And excuse me if you already know all this. I'm not quite sure what to assume about your familiarity with this stuff. I didn't include a little flow diagram about how federated access works, but basically it's a way that allows Jim to use his Illinois credential, or me, my Chicago credential, or Marlene, his Indiana University credential, to log into stuff all over the world. Okay, and that global infrastructure is sort of represented here in this picture, and it's organized into national federations. In common is the federation in the United States, and these federations publish some of their identity providers. That's the things that we log in with, like Chicago, Illinois, or Indiana's identity provider, and service provider. Those are the things you log in to, like a gateway, perhaps. And then some of those are published into EduGain, and those are then made available. That EduGain catalog of thousands of identity providers and service providers across 59 countries are available for at Federated Access. So I think for a gateway operator, where you might see yourself in that where it says hub, bridge, gateway over there, where there may be some services, the kinds of things that Jim showed on the right side of that opening slide of his that are protected by or bridged by the Science Gateway, is where you might use the federation to allow users from all over the world, basically, thousands of organizations all over the world, to be able to potentially access your gateway materials. So Jim, could you advance, please? So federation is, first of all, authentication over that on a global scale, but there's some additional stuff that can come along that is often of value. Jim mentioned attributes, and federation provides a means of delivering attributes, most specifically the so-called research and scholarship attributes, which would basically just be name, email, a persistent identifier, and your affiliation at your university. So that's something called the RNS program, which I won't go into. Just that those kinds of attributes, those basic attributes, are often available, and we'll see often not available as well. Multi-factor authentication, where an identity provider like Chicago or Indiana already implements some form of multi-factor, federation is able to convey the fact that multi-factor was used, or a relying party like a Science Gateway might request that multi-factor be used, and there's a protocol, a federation protocol for signaling, I'd like MFA now, please, and for the identity provider to respond and say, you got it, or I didn't, or whatever, but the point is they can negotiate about that. There are also assurance profiles, thinking about some of the more, where the riskier resources, where there may be actual risk to unauthorized access. And so there are several assurance profiles that have been developed to meet, that were driven to meet the needs of international research collaboration. So these are not federal government kinds of things, although they do bear a distant cousin, relationship resemblance there. But they're driven directly by addressing some of the needs of research collaborations. So that's something to check into, and federation can signal whether or not, when Marlene logs in from IU, has he met the requirements of a given assurance profile, in case that's important for your gateway. And then there's also a lot of other stuff that kind of goes along that can make the user experience, more positive, like the logo of the site the user's logging into, or that they're logging in from. and contacts at the various sites, at the service providers and the identity providers, in case things go wrong. And increasingly important, and I think especially around the topic for today, where we're talking about getting pretty crisp with access control and authorization. You want that because, there's a downside if things go wrong. And so InCommon Federation has an established incident response procedure. And internationally, there's a great deal of effort being invested right now in having a similar capability extend across all 59 of those countries, across the entire world, for having coordinated incident response for when bad things happen, that we can deal with them well. That's all good. You won't be surprised to hear that with thousands of organizations and dozens of countries across the world, that not everything goes uniformly well. And so that's certainly the case, and that can result in some pain in use of federated access as well. My kind of headline for the explanation of when things don't work well as to what's going on, it's often that with thousands of organizations, there's always going to be a fair number that aren't really paying attention to all the latest updates about things. And so sometimes, and some federations are better than others, perhaps, at managing that natural situation and trying to keep everyone on the same page. So for purposes of science gateways, I would say that authentication is going to work quite well. If you want to rely solely on federation for some of those research and scholarship attributes, that's going to be a hit or miss proposition right now. Those logos and contacts and things like that are good for user experience, also hit or miss on an international basis, although I would say that InCommon, the US Federation now, is north of, I think, 95% of all of the entities in that federation now have all of those things. And because InCommon has developed procedures for ensuring that all of its entities maintain things like that in a fresh way. And then there can be some interop issues. The national federations can publish somewhat different views of the whole overall global federated access network, and so that can result in some interop issues that we won't go into. So the point is, it's a really valuable resource. If you don't want to manage credentials for everybody, and you want them to come, and the gateway users come from all over, this can be a great fit. There can be some issues, and the partnership between Internet2 and the SCCI can be one of the means of trying to iron out any of those issues should they arise. Jim, could you go ahead, please? So I want to give you a little bit of homework when you're done here, just a few things to look into. There's a recently published paper called Federated Identity Management for Research version 2. Both Jim and I and 38 of our best friends collaborated on producing that. Reflects a great deal of work collecting data about a lot of different research communities around the world. And so you can read in its Appendix B 14 some details about how 14 different ones of those do their gateway kinds of things. And I think that might be, in addition to the catalog, the SCCI catalog, another way to look at to see how other folks have attacked similar problems. So there's some starting points in there, and each of those 14 have references for further reading if one of them seems to be worth your time to delve further into. One of those 14 is something called Elixir, which is a gateway that actually is used by a number of life sciences research communities. I forget the number, but it's growing. It's something like 20 different communities are kind of have their access to their resources managed by this common gateway. I'm going to give you a little bit of a look at that in the next slide. There's also something called the ARC blueprint architecture for things like these gateways. And Elixir is an example. CI logon that Jim might talk about, I think, in a few minutes, is another example of that, and so on. And then I also don't want to forget in the homework slide here that we're talking about managing user access and authorization, and closely allied oftentimes in environments where there's some risk involved. You might want to also think about the data transfer into and out of a secure or protected environment, as well as the users kind of going into and out of that environment. And just wanted to kind of note that the Globus transfer service has a new high assurance version that's suited to those environments. Jim,
quick question for you,
yes.
Tom. Yeah, before you go on too far. There was one question about, and I think that your this current slide might have answered it, but just in case it doesn't, Donnie asks, what is a good resource for getting started with RNS attributes? I collect these attributes for my gateway with a custom sign-up form. So would these examples offer that?
None of these links goes directly to that, but I'll tell you what, when I get done talking, I will post a link in the chat. That takes you right to the RNS information page, and in common, it'll tell you just what to do, okay?
Fantastic,
Great.
and we'll make sure to repost that on our website, too, when we post the slides.
Thank you. Great question.
Thanks. And then another question was from John, said, persistent ID, would that be where I stuff my ORCID?
It could, probably it would not be the ORCID. The persistent ID that was referred to there is one that the home institution, like University of Chicago or University of Illinois, supplies. Okay, so at the University of Chicago, the persistent ID that you're likely to get is going to be, there's a couple of different choices, but the most common one is going to be tbarton@uchicago.edu. It looks like my email address, actually happens to be the same string, needn't be always an email thing, but it's going to be something like that. It's going to always be me every time I come back, and it's going to be unique to the University of Chicago. So that's a persistent ID supplied from the home organization. Some home organizations also manage ORCID IDs on behalf of all their faculty and students. So that may be something that can be put in. It's not part of the research and scholarship specification. So an ORCID ID most likely would not come through that channel to the Science Gateway. ORCID itself, the ORCID has an identity provider itself, and it's also in Federation and in EduGain, and it supplies an ORCID ID for a persistent identifier. I hope that addressed the question fully enough.
Looks like some thanks came along. So, yep, looks like you got you did answer their questions, so you can carry on.
Okay, I'll carry. Thank you. People don't usually invite me to carry on. They certainly won't do that a second time, but I'll excuse you, Catherine, this time. Okay, so here is a really high-level picture, a real eye chart. I'm not going to go through all of about Elixir, as I mentioned a moment ago. But you can kind of see, whereas Jim's picture at the beginning went from left to right, users on the left, resources on the right, this one goes from bottom to top. So the users are below, and it shows they log in through EduGain or through common things like Google or LinkedIn and so forth, or ORCID. And it talks about, and it kind of shows that that the user's login from an external source is enriched a bit in a couple of different ways here inside of their gateway. First of all, on the right, you can see a directory and some boxes of information feeding into it, which has to do with roles or different kinds of authorizations. This is basically feeding in, enriching the login information with that information that Jim was talking about. And this is how they do it in Elixir, where they have a variety of different policies they must implement. So some data sets require a data access committee to authorize access to, so there's some toxic data. And on an individual basis, researchers are allowed to access individual data sets by a data access committee, and they record the artifacts of their determinations in a database there. There's also a group and role management using some software called Parun, which is very much like co-manage and grouper. And there's some other examples of that as well. The other parts about this that I would mention is that there's two other functions inside this gateway, which are very much to do with how authorization and policy management happens. One is a step-up authentication. So if you want, as Elixir often does, multi-factor, a strong authentication, and they didn't get it from the user's home organization, they can get it, they can add it in themselves in this point. And then they're also using CI logon in a narrow way, noting that of the different kinds of resources that are for which the access is being integrated through this gateway, there's a variety. They were not all built by the same people to a common architecture. There's a variety of different token types, OAuth or X509 certificates or SAML assertions or what have you. And they're relying on CI logon's credential translation capabilities to address that need within their environment. So I just wanted to kind of begin to, and all of those elements are things that are part of that blueprint model that I mentioned on the previous slide that I'm sure you'll all become familiar with when you've done your homework. Next slide, please, Jim. So I want to finish with an eye chart that I will go through some of. This is an environment here at the University of Chicago, our Secure Data Enclave. And it's an environment where there is really those research data sets that have the greatest liability, where we store and process those. Okay, so they're often coming in with data use agreements with more or less onerous terms, or there's a research grant with flow down security requirements that are somewhat onerous, kind of a thing. And so this is a partnership between the university's Research Computing Center, which runs under the Provost's office, and the central IT people, which is not. And this is so the top left kind of color key really is my main message here, is that the research user access is managed through delegated management by the Secure Data Enclave staff, but they're using a centrally operated IAM infrastructure. And so that made it that ability to leverage a mature IAM infrastructure made it that much easier to implement this secure computing environment that's stuff in the red on the right. I want to point out the delegation. There's the accounts that users use in our instance here are university accounts. They're not federated at this point. A lot of this stuff could take federated, but we haven't gone there yet. And so absent that, when a non-University of Chicago collaborator in a research project is going to be given access, there's a way for the Secure Data Enclave staff to provide that directly. They don't need to talk to the folks in central IT. And likewise, as each principal investigator's project gets onboarded into the environment, the Secure Data Enclave staff make another delegation to allow the principal investigator to manage their project's users, okay, individually. All of those kinds of artifacts are collected inside of Grouper along with other things that happen. When people sign up for Duo two-factor here, for example, or have the attributes to be allowed to access the VPN and things like that. And all of those artifacts are provisioned by one means or another from Grouper into the infrastructure, a variety of parallel infrastructures for doing authentication and access controls across the Secure Data Enclave environment and in many other environments at the University of Chicago. So basically the idea there is with all that green stuff at the bottom, you have similar technical control capabilities, and so you can apply shibboleth, LDAP, or Active Directory to the corresponding element as suits it best, and have have a heterogeneous approach to that particular access control technology that's available. I'm not going to go into too much what's in the red stuff, what's inside the Secure Data Enclave. That's a little bit beside the point here. There's a bunch of good stuff, just suffice it to say, and it's all arrayed in a way so that depending on where the users are and what we know about their end user device and so forth, that the basic policies that their end-to-end sessions are always encrypted and that there's always strong authentication. And that only the authorized SDE users are kind of allowed through, are technically arise out of this design. So I just want to kind of say again, this is Internet2 can help gateway designers, and Trusted CI and other partners can, and as well as the SGCI hands-on help that was talked about earlier. But also it's possible that your campus central IT people might actually have something of use to a science gateway environment, because it could be that they've got a lot of stuff of this sort ready to go. And if they do, it's worth looking at it because it's actually really hard to do this very well. And so I just wanted to give that example. And I think with that, I'm done. And Jim, I don't know if you're going to say something or if you want to hand it over to Marlene.
Before you hand it off, there was a question that came in that was answered by another participant, but maybe you have something to add, which was about any kind of federation available, body available for students in K through 12, and that was from Joe, and Terry responded that that you have the steward program at InCommon, and I didn't know if there's anything else you would want to mention about that before Marlene gets started.
That's another great question. In fact, the real answer is no, that there is not a federation, there's not federated access provided on anything like a broad basis for K-12 in the U.S. or most other nations. There was work done towards that objective some years ago that gave rise in part to the steward program that link references, but that is not really active now. So and there really isn't at this point, I think, enough motivation around nationally to try to address that problem. That is, it doesn't seem that folks have problems that are worthwhile enough to motivate enough of all other parties to actually provide solutions to it. So that's not going to be happening except by exception, but not on a national scale at this time.
Great, thanks. So that's it for questions for the moment.
Okay, take it away, Marlene.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marlene, and how's my audio? Sound good? Okay.
Yep, you sound good.
Great. So I'm going to talk about Science Gateway security with a new project called Custos. It's a recent NSF CC or CICI award with Jim and NSF Kim, Suresh Maroof, and myself from IU, and some senior personnel listed here. Next slide, please. So I want to step back and get on a soapbox and hopefully not trip. Science gateways in science. I think, to motivate some of this, I have grown tired of my own definition of a science gateway, which is it's this thing that broadens access to supercomputers and whatnot. Science gateways support scientific research. They enable people to make publishable scientific, undertake publishable scientific research and create artifacts that can be used in journal articles and other types of scientific communications. So gateways are really there to produce, reproduce, manage, and publish scientific digital content. So I gathered up a few colleagues and we hashed out some of these ideas, and this is in proceedings of International Workshop of Science Gateways 2018, and you can look it up if you're interested. Next slide, please. But so what that has to do with cybersecurity? It means that we really need to, as a community, mature our approach. And it's not just a matter of something like protecting passwords. If you go through the Open Science cyber risk profile that Jim mentioned earlier, it's really it's a good read. And it's eye-opening, and we all need to think about risks, not just about break-ins, but what happens if, gateway, the results of a gateway get compromised, or if people can no longer trust what we're doing. So there's many aspects to security, not all of which are purely mechanistic. So next slide. So I have my own version of a gateway cartoon, kind of the same parts that Jim had. I'm going to use a bit more color. On the left, we have the science communities, use gateways. And on the right, we have the things that are typically powering a gateway. The third-party resources a gateway provides access to, supercomputers on Exceed, your campus clusters, scientific instruments, commercial clouds, and so forth. So the two parts in the middle, we split. This is obviously from the perspective of our Apache Aravatha project, but we have on the middle left the Science Gateway user environments or user interfaces, which talk with middleware on the inner right to enact what a user wants to do. So in our world, we have single instance middleware that supports multiple tenant gateways. And of course, now if you look at what are some important aspects of security from a gateway point of view that we need to support, well, obviously it's the theme of the meeting here, but first of all is user management. So authentication, what information you want the user to provide about themselves, or what you want to be filled in automatically from another provider, information such as that. Then there's resource connection management, or if you prefer, secrets. So these are the things that govern the connections between the middleware and the backend resources on the far right there. So, if you're talking about SSH connections, that might be key management. But as Jim mentioned earlier, and we'll wrap up saying more about, I think, OAuth 2 is also an extremely important mechanism here, which I hope we'll be able to move to in the cybersecurity or in the cyber infrastructure world. And so there you need to manage, the gateway needs to manage security tokens. And then finally, there's the whole business of what somebody actually does with the gateway, and that's they create digital, essentially, I'd like to think of it, or I'm trying to think of it more as they're creating digital content or digital objects that need to be managed. So this is, if somebody runs a job through a gateway with certain parameters that get certain inputs, or uses certain inputs and get certain outputs, that's a digital object. And so if somebody wants to share that in a controlled way, how do they do that? So that's the third aspect of security that we're going to consider. Next slide. So if you go a little bit through the cybersecurity review process that I alluded to earlier, you can identify the risk associated with each of these assets from the previous slide. And what we essentially propose to do is provide some mitigation strategies that are going to build upon both the technology we have in-house and technology that we here at IU and technology from our partners and technology from third-party providers into a system that can be used and more easily consumed by science gateways. But before going to that, I'll say the big risk, the overriding risk here is if we don't do this well, there's going to be a loss of trust in gateways by users. If they're mismanaging your passwords or things like that. By resource providers, Exceed has done a wonderful thing for gateways for a number of years by providing community accounts. If they ever decide that's too much of a risk, then this is going to be a major drag on the community, and also just the general scientific community, as more and more research papers are published because of what a gateway can provide. Next slide. So our founding premises are, first, the gateways should move away from operating their own cybersecurity solutions for identity management, secrets management, and sharing. These are tricky to do well, and you're running a gateway, and for a number of years, very well that operations and maintenance are hidden costs that you may not have accounted for. How much effort does it take to keep critical parts of your infrastructure up to date? The next, in the middle, gateway cybersecurity should be based on open source software, be community driven, should implement best practices, and there should be open source that anyone can expect, audit, and potentially contribute to. And then the last of our premises here is that cybersecurity should be a service. The service should be operated for clients or tenants, and it should be based on best security practices. It's based on this open source software. It's accessed through secure APIs, but also, again, just as the source is open, the infrastructure deployment mechanisms are also open. This infrastructure as a code is the cliche, but it's a good one for how to do this. We want to operate a service, but not have any secret sauce in the way it's done. The next slide. So our overall plan for Custos is many of these capabilities are currently already part of Apache Auth in one form or another, and we can create tenants now that provide some of these core capabilities. But we also but our real plan here is to extract these capabilities as a new standalone project for several reasons. First of all, we're focusing on not just Arvata gateways, but Galaxy gateways, and then also thinking about the requirements of Jupyter Hub based gateways. We want to leverage, of course, CI logon, CI logon 2, the CI tokens work from Jim, the Galaxy expertise with cloud integration and scale. And we want to take this project to the Apache Software Foundation, where we have a well-defined open source governance model about how these projects are operated. And then we'll also be taking Custos. So we've already taken our Arvata through Trusted CI review, but we'll be doing that on three different cycles in this project. And then we'll be considering how to integrate third-party software at key places. So we're already using, for identity management, we're basing this on Keycloak and building on top of Jim's CI logon service. But so for secrets management, this is in-house software. Take our own advice here and look very closely at software that's good for managing secrets from a third-party provider, and the same with the digital objects management. The next slide. So our Get Out of the Gate project is do this for 100,000 people. So Galaxy is a slide from Innis, and so Galaxy has an interesting challenge in that they have Galaxy main, but several other instances that they would like to know more about and provide ultimately Galaxy as a service so that they can provide a federated login for all of these services. And so this is something that we can do today by combining identity management pieces and group management pieces that exist within our code base that build upon Keycloak and CI logon and our sharing service. The next slide. Thank you. So here's the whole set of services that we're providing behind a single API. Our goal, of course, is that you can take some of these things a la carte, but really the power comes when they are used in multiple ways. So, for example, providing sharing services that manage access to identities, but also manage access to tokens. So, for example, if we want to integrate with a third-party OAuth 2 based service like Box, which is one of our early deliverables, that will touch upon a couple of different of our three cornerstone security aspects. Next slide. So if you're interested in getting involved, this is currently a sub-project of Arvata before we spin it off, and so we welcome more participation and questions there. Thanks. Next.
Thanks, Marlene. So this is Jim again, and I'm checking the chat room and not seeing
questions.
any.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good to go. Although there was a question earlier that was for you that we caught after Tom started talking about OAuth. I think it got answered more or less, but it was about whether when you, it was from Mona, and she was wondering whether a user can choose which items they allow and which not from the list of access requested by the app. And someone answered her that it was in general that a gateway should only request what items they need, and then a user accepts or denies all. Would that be the case?
Right. Yeah, I saw that. That's a good answer by Donnie there. So even though the OAuth protocol does allow for the possibility that you might get fewer scopes back than what you request, in practice, you really expect just a yes or no answer from the user. And so sometimes you see that this application is asking for too much, and so I just can't. That's a pretty frustrating experience. But it's difficult to build an application that can handle getting fewer authorization scopes than it really needs.
Great, thanks for that clarification.
Yep, good question. Okay, so I'm going to, so thanks to Tom and Marlene for both mentioning CI Logon. I will just highlight some of the access management capabilities that are part of the CI Logon Identity and Access Management platform. There's an open source hosted platform that can be used by Science Gateways. And so one of them is for attribute-based authorization. We find that the EduPerson affiliation attribute or the EduPerson scoped affiliation attribute that we get from campus can be really useful for authorizing access to resources. You might have a software license or scientific data that is only licensed for use by faculty, staff, and students at US educational institutions, for example. And so the EduPerson affiliation attribute could be really helpful for doing that type of attribute-based access control. And so CI Logon looks for that attribute in the SAML assertion and passes it along in the other types of credentials that CI Logon issues, like an OpenID Connect ID token. And so here's just an example of the SAML assertion showing that I am staff at the University of Illinois. Another access control method supported by CI Logon is group-based or role-based access control. And we do that through the power of the open source Internet2 co-managed software. And so we provide hosted co-managed instances where collaborations can manage their group memberships and roles through custom enrollment flows that support expiration policies. So at the end of the semester, for example, students could be asked to confirm that they're still enrolled for the next semester, or you can check a database to confirm that they're still enrolled, or otherwise they'll expire. Also ask the professor if they should expire out of the group. There's ability to manage self-service permissions, so that's where collaborators can form their own groups and define who is a member of the group for access to the data in the collaboration. And really powerful pipelines and plugins for integration with applications and other sources of attributes and group memberships and roles to support authorization. So cilogon.org/co-manage, you can see more details about how we're using that open source co-managed software as part of the CI Logon platform. And so the result then is we can have a CI Logon identity token that includes my affiliation and also includes membership information about a research collaboration, in this case, that I'm a member of the LSST users group. And lastly, I want to make sure that we cover capabilities-based authorization. And the SciTokens project is one example where we are using open source software to demonstrate the use of capabilities-based authorization in a distributed scientific computing environment or scenario. So we're using CI Logon for authentication, but then your identity and group memberships and roles turns into an authorization for specific capabilities to access a specific resource or perform specific operations on a resource. And that can go with your jobs submitted through Condor and for accessing resources like data resources on CVMFS and XRootD. We're building this all on OAuth and JSON Web Tokens and doing it all open source and standards-based. So some more info at scitokens.org about that. And so this slide provides an example of a JSON Web Token from the SciToken software that's giving a very specific access scope on that first line that's saying the holder of this token can read the protected directory and write to the user 25321 storage directory. And it also specifies the audience. So the token may be used with a specific application, who issued the token. And so the issuer may be specific to a research collaboration. The subject is the user, the holder of the token, and then the tokens can be short-lived and support refresh through the standard OAuth refresh token capabilities. So we did a quick tour through many aspects of authorization, policies, procedures, and mechanisms, models and examples like the Elixir example, I think, is a particularly good one. We saw some examples of attribute-based and role-based and capabilities-based authorization. I really did a hard sell about the good OAuth and JSON Web Token standards. And I think overall, we talked about how there's excellent open source options for access management. So you don't need to roll your own. And there's help available through the SGCI partners like Trusted CI and Internet2. And as Tom mentioned, good support on campus through Campus Central IT with some resources there that can help you out. So that's our presentation today. Thank you very much for attending. And I think we may still have a few minutes for more questions and comments. And those are our email addresses if you want to follow up over email. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim and Tom and Marlene. I'm totally impressed with how much information you conveyed in less than an hour. So awesome with questions too. So
I'm totally impressed that we got through all those slides in the hour.
Yeah, way to go. I'm in awe. So I'll give the folks who are attending to have a moment to think if they have any other questions they'd like to post in chat, since we do have a few more minutes to go. We'll make sure that your slides are posted, and so they'll have your contact information. I'm going to steal the screen share from you and just show some additional information for folks who might be interested in attending our next month or giving us feedback. I did put a link into chat for giving us feedback on the webinar as well. Our next webinar will be also the second Wednesday of the month. We are finalizing the title right now, so I don't have that for you just yet, but you can sign up for our newsletter and we'll definitely let you know about it, as well as we always let you know the day before. So that's where you can sign up in that link that you can see right there. So with that, let's see, are any more questions coming in? I don't see any. So any last thoughts from our terrific set of presenters and about things that we should know? No? You have everything. You said everything you need to say.
I think so. Just thanks again. And, we've got as we mentioned, the partnerships with SGCI, so you can don't hesitate to follow up with us.
That's I want to reiterate that. That's be my main message to everyone. There's some facts and figures and so forth, but the main thing is there's a lot of help to be had, and it's not an area to kind of wade out. It's deep water, so ask for help with this part of your task. We're happy to provide it or share you to people that can help you.
Yeah, and I'll mention too that your the Trusted CI and obviously Internet2 as well have a tremendous amount of information on their websites as well for just providing an introduction and resources. I mean, as you can see in the chat, we'll be grabbing the chat here from the webinar so that we can repost some of the questions and answers and links for people who are interested in grabbing those or didn't get them just now. But it's true, you guys are both terrific resources that SGCI is really happy to have a connection with because of all of what you have to offer. So, well, with that, I think we're almost at the top of the hour. So thank you, Tom and Jim and Marlene. And I see some positive feedback coming through. If you can see the chat, you'll see that you have a happy audience too. So, yes, thank you for, as John put it, an hour well spent.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.